My name is Sarah Chertoff. I am an Aliyah advisor in our Aliyah division. I'm so excited that you're joining us here this afternoon to talk about planning your Aliyah, especially geared towards families for 2021. Today, we are going to be covering sort of the broad overview of everything that you need to know when you are working through the processing and the paperwork side of your Aliyah planning, as well as the actual plans of where you're going to live and what you're going to do, to help you have a framework to move forward and make your Aliyah dreams a reality. We understand that there are a lot of people on the webinar today, and some of you will be at different stages in your Aliyah planning. There's a lot of very helpful information, something for everybody. Throughout the session, if anybody has questions, please make sure to use the Q&A box. Don't use the chat. And we have a dedicated team. Some of my colleagues, Karen Richmond and Ari Weiss, and myself will be answering questions in the Q&A box as we go along. The session is being recorded. So if you miss anything, don't worry, it'll be sent out in the next 2 days. If you have an Aliyah advisor and you have specific questions that come up, please make sure to reach out to your Aliyah advisor with your questions. If you don't yet have an advisor, please email us at aliyah, ALIYAH, @nbn.org.il. That'll be up in the Q&A box, and we will help you get the answers to your questions. I would like to introduce my colleague, Ari Weiss, who is going to be starting off this session, helping you get your Aliyah planning underway.
Thank you so much, Sarah. My name is Ari, and I am an Aliyah advisor as well at Nefesh Benefits. I've had the privilege of working with Nefesh Benefits, assisting Olim now for over 7 years, almost 7 years, excuse me. And my wife and I made Aliyah close to 8 years ago. And like I said, it's been a privilege to be able to assist Olim families, and that's really what we're going to be discussing. My job is really to cover more the procedural side of Aliyah, as we're going to see. And it's important to understand, we're going to run rather quickly, and I understand, as Sarah also mentioned, people are in different stages of their Aliyah processing right now. Some people may be planning on coming during the summer. Some people may be planning on coming before the end of the year. So therefore, some of this information for some people may be review. For some people, it's going to be more planning aspect. They're going to have to look into it more to see how it's going to relate to them. But everyone is going to get something from this webinar. So we're going to move forward here. I'm going to ask if we can go to the next slide. And we can get started now talking about Aliyah in 2021. As we mentioned, there's two sides of Aliyah. There's a procedural side, and there's also the planning aspect. Now, both are equally as important. Procedural side is basically the bureaucratic aspect, which we're going to talk about, the documentation, the nitty-gritty, meeting with the Jewish agency, the process itself. And as you can see, some of those things that we're going to be covering listed there. And at the same time, though, there's also the planning aspect. Those are things like where you're going to be living, how you're going to be supporting yourselves, where your kids are going to be going to school, things of that nature. And they are, like I said, equally important. The procedural side, which is what I'm going to be covering, is going to be key, first and foremost, because it's going to most closely determine the timeline. The biggest thing that holds people up in terms of their Aliyah plans generally is going to be the procedural aspect. How quickly you can put the documents together, how quickly you're ready to have an interview with the Jewish agency, as we're going to discuss right now. So let's jump into it. And again, I apologize if I'm going a little quickly. I was born and brought up in the Northeast, and people tell me that I speak quickly. As Sarah mentioned, we are recording this webinar, so and you will be getting a copy of it a day or two after we're done, so you'll be able to look it over in slow motion if needed. So here we go. Okay. First thing is, what is Aliyah? When we talk about Aliyah, there's two things we talk about. Number one is Israeli citizenship. When you're making Aliyah, you are gaining Israeli citizenship. For those of you who are US and Canadian citizens, you will have dual citizenship. If you are US and Canadian, you'll have triple citizenship, whatever they call it. But your Israeli citizenship is not going to affect your US citizenship nor your Canadian citizenship. From this point forward, after you make Aliyah, you're going to be James Bond. You're always going to be traveling with two passports. as is the rule. But that's okay, and that's part of making Aliyah, getting that Israeli citizenship. As we're going to see, for many people, believe it or not, some of you may know this, some of you may be a surprise to you, you may already have Israeli citizenship from your parents, or maybe because you were born in Israel to Israeli parents. But even still, though, even though you don't need the Israeli citizenship because you already have it, making Aliyah is also the second part, and that is the Aliyah benefits, the door prizes, as I like to say. And those are all the gifts and special presents that the state of Israel awards you. And these are things that are awarded in the short term, as we're going to see, and also they extend even to the long term. So both of these things are important aspects when we talk about Aliyah, and they're both going to be represented in the documentation that you have to collect. There are going to be things there that are needed for your citizenship. There are things that are going to be needed for your benefits as well. So let's move on to the next slide. So now that we know a little bit about Aliyah, let's talk about who's bringing you home, as we say. You know, who are the bureaucrats in your neighborhood? Who's going to be involved with this process? So of course, anyone who's making Aliyah from North America automatically is working with two organizations. Nefesh B'Nefesh is a private organization. We are a non-government organization. We promote Aliyah, we facilitate Aliyah, and we want to help to make your Aliyah as simple as and as successful as possible. And we work alongside with the Jewish Agency for Israel. That's the second organization. The Jewish Agency is the government organization. It's an Israeli government organization that oversees Aliyah from abroad. Anyone making Aliyah from outside of Israel has to go through the Jewish Agency and get the Aliyah approval from the Jewish Agency. And as I mentioned, North America is special because you have the assistance of both organizations. The Jewish Agency handling the bureaucracy, doing the bureaucratic side. They'll be actually checking and approving your documentation. And you have the assistance of Nefesh B'Nefesh, the service organization. We're there to provide the guidance in that process. You will also be interacting with the Israeli consulate. For most people, the Israeli consulate will be introduced at the very end of the process when it's time to get what's called your Aliyah visa. Your Aliyah visa is, so to speak, your golden ticket at the end of the entire thing. And all this process we're going through is so that you can get that Aliyah visa. Once you have the Aliyah visa, basically it's like the trigger is cocked. You're ready to go to Israel. The next trip you take to Israel, when you'll bring your documentation, will be processed upon arrival. For those with Israeli citizenship already, again, we'll come back to that, but with those already with Israeli citizenship, you will probably be interacting with the Israeli consulate if you don't yet have your passports, or if your children have Israeli citizenship that they might have inherited from you, then you will be interacting with the Israeli consulate as well to register your children as Israelis already before Aliyah and to get Israeli passports. Again, I'm giving you a lot of bits information. We're going to come back to some of those things, and some of those things your Aliyah advisors will follow up with. Finally, there's Misrad HaKlita. That's the Ministry of Aliyah and Integration, the Ministry of Absorption. They're the ones that basically are responsible for your benefits. Now, it's very simplified the way I'm presenting it, but you may hear of things having to do with Misrad HaKlita, the Ministry of Absorption, while you're going through the processing, while you're collecting documentation, and because they are, of course, a vital aspect of Aliyah from outside of Israel. They're the ones that actually approve you for your Aliyah benefits, for all those door prizes. Okay, so let's move on. Now that we know some of the organizations that you're going to be, with whom you're going to be interacting, let's talk about the process. What exactly is the process? So number one, now again, many of you already have submitted your application. If you are planning on Aliyah in 2021, by the way, if you're not planning on Aliyah in 2021, this is not the webinar for you. There is another one coming up in a number of days for long term. But for now, those coming in 2021, you should have already submitted an online application on the Nefesh B'Nefesh website. If you have not, that's your first thing to do this afternoon after the webinar. Don't turn off the webinar. But after the webinar, go onto our website, nbn.org.il. In the top right-hand corner, there's a little button that says apply. Click on that and follow the instructions. Give yourself about 25 minutes to a half hour to do it. There's a lot of questions, but that is going to be critical. So step one is fill out the application. Then you're going to, after you've submitted the application, you'll be assigned an Aliyah advisor. might even be myself. But either way, you'll be assigned an Aliyah advisor, and you're going to have an online portal. This is what we create for you, listing the documentation that you're going to have to start collecting. You'll be uploading copies of those documents by way of your online portal. It's pretty cool. And this way you can keep track of what's been submitted. And this way also the Nefesh B'Nefesh data department can interact with you and let you know if there's an issue with any of those documents that has to be updated. Once you've collected the documentation, the next step is going to be the scheduling of your Jewish agency interview. The interviews now, because of COVID, are done long distance. They're done remotely, although they will need to see the documentation itself. So they'll arrange that with you, whether you'll send it to them or whether you'll drop it off. But once you've had that interview and you've shown them and collected all of the documentation that's required, depending again on something we're going to come back to called your Aliyah status, it could take a number of weeks. Normally it will take 3 or 4 weeks to get your Aliyah approval. If it's a little bit more complicated, which could happen sometimes with benefits and different statuses, which we'll talk about, but it could take a little bit longer. But finally, you'll be notified by email. You'll get an email from the Jewish agency saying, Mazal Tov, you've been approved for Aliyah. And now you're not finished yet, because then you'll have one last step, as I mentioned, to get what's called your Aliyah visa. That comes from the Israeli consulate. The Jewish agency will provide instructions on how to get that. And finally, once you have that Aliyah visa, the only step left is to schedule to book your Aliyah flight, which you will do through Nefesh B'Nefesh. And as I mentioned, you'll come on that flight. You'll be processed when you arrive. Depending on your Aliyah status, you would be walking out of the airport 45 minutes later as an Israeli citizen with Israeli healthcare. So it's very, very exciting. That's the procedural side, so to speak, in a nutshell. Let's move on. I know we're moving quickly, but now that you understand from the procedural side, let's talk about the nitty gritty. Here we go. Now, again, many of you, those of you who are looking to come this summer, already should be deep in the throes of these documents, but we're going to review them in a general way. Remember, and it's very important to keep this perspective, because a lot of times, and thank God I've had the privilege of working with a lot of Olim, a lot of times people look at these documents and they're asking, what in the world is all this about? Isn't this just, I'm a Jew, I'm coming home. What's the problem? Why do I have to go through all of this stuff? And we have to keep in mind that from wherever we came from, coming to Israel and making Aliyah is applying for citizenship in a foreign country. Right? We all think of it because we're coming home. We think we're just going to arrive in Ben Gurion, go over to the fridge, open up the fridge, and take out a sandwich, and we're home. But it's more than that, obviously. There are international rules in play here. There are things that have to be done because we are applying for citizenship. It's a foreign country. Just to contrast, I took a look with my wife not long ago, just a peek to see what it takes to get U.S. citizenship. And I was blown away at how much money it costs up front and how long, the years that it takes to get U.S. citizenship. I didn't look up Canadian citizenship. And then contrast that with the things that are required when you make Aliyah and how long it takes. It's nothing. It's ridiculous, the amount of time. And not only that, when you arrive in Israel, they throw money at you. So if you don't know about that, just hang in there. So let's talk a little bit about the basic documentation. And again, keep in mind that we're applying for citizenship in a foreign country. Number one, of course, you do need a valid passport. Valid passport means that when you get your Aliyah visa, your passport needs to still have a year left before it expires. In certain situations, the Jewish agency might be lenient down to maybe a few months less than that, maybe 6 months or more. But ideally, it has to be valid it has to be still good for at least a year after your Aliyah date. Otherwise, they're not going to put that Aliyah visa into it. Additionally, you need something called a proof of Judaism, which is it's a letter or letters indicating your Jewish lineage or the source of your Jewish faith. Now, why is this important? I've gotten a lot of Olim that call me and they say, why do I have to prove that I'm Jewish? Of course I'm Jewish. And I tell them the same thing. This process is entirely bureaucratic in nature. This proof of Judaism letter has nothing to do with religiosity. It's all bureaucracy. And it's very important to understand that. When someone makes Aliyah, the only way one can make Aliyah is if he or she falls under what's called the law of return, which means that only those who are Jewish, either Jewish through lineage, Jewish through conversion or Jewish through marriage, are able to make Aliyah. And now the Jewish agency has no interest in getting involved in any kind of religious questions, so they do it very simply. They say if you were born Jewish, if you're Jewish by lineage, you need to provide a letter from a synagogue rabbi written on synagogue letterhead saying that the rabbi knows you to be Jewish and born to a Jewish mother, father. If it's from a grandparent, also it has to be stipulated. But it needs to say those two things, that you're Jewish, number one, currently, and number two, attesting to Jewish lineage. Someone who has converted into Judaism is also 100% Jewish. The documentation they require is a little more extensive. They require the conversion certificate. They require a few letters from a rabbi. They want to hear a letter from you telling about your backstory, and they want to hear something about your involvement in the community after conversion, as well as the process involved, what you had to go through to study this curriculum, the syllabus, things of that nature. Why are they doing that? Because they, believe it or not, Israeli passports are very much in high demand, and they want to make sure that the person, believe it or not, this actually happens. They want to make sure that it's somebody who didn't convert on the fly, so to speak, just to get an Israeli passport. Now, obviously, that's not the case here, but this is the reason why they request all of these documents. What else? There's a birth certificate. You need to have your what you call your long form birth certificate. That's the birth certificate that also lists your parents' names on it. Very important. It will need something called an apostille, which we're going to come back to. Apostille is the scourge of Aliyah documentation. You may have heard of it. But basically, it's an international authentication. We'll a little bit more on that in a moment. But you need your birth certificate. Anyone and everyone who is making Aliyah in the family, you need to have their birth certificates, and they need to be the long form, having the parents' names on it. You need to have your marital status certificate. And also with an apostille, what is a marital status certificate? Someone who is married, they need to have, that person needs to have a marriage certificate. Someone who is divorced needs to have a divorce decree or divorce certificate, depending on how they do it in the state. And also the marriage certificate as well from when that person got married. Someone who is a widow or a widower needs the death certificate of the late spouse, as well, again, as the marriage certificate. Anyone who is previously married, meaning that the current marriage is not the first marriage, that person will need documentation from the original marriage as well. This is actually very key because you will notice that on our application that you fill out, it may or may not actually ask you about previous marriages. So it's something that you should be aware of yourself. If there's a previous marriage, that you'll need that documentation as well from the previous marriage. Very, very important, and be aware of it. Let's move on. Just when you thought it was safe to move forward, there's more documents. Here we go. There's forms from the Jewish agency. Now, fortunately, most of these are simple to fill out on your own. One of them is called a health declaration, which every person in the family making Aliyah has to fill out one, or you can fill it out on their behalf. There's one specifically for adults. There's one for children. It's basically the kind of thing you fill out the first time you go to the doctor. You know, have you ever had this? Have you ever had this? Are you taking any meds? Things like that. Why? The reason why they request it, one of the main reasons, is because it assists with planning. If there is some type of a medication that a person is taking, the Jewish agency will want to be sure that you have research to make sure that it's available for you in Israel. If, God forbid, if there's some type of a medical necessity, treatment, something that's ongoing, that's obviously a very important aspect of planning. And they want to be able to follow up, as we do at Nefesh B'Nefesh, to make sure that whatever needs to be put in place to ensure that you have that, whatever it is that's needed, it will be in place. So that's the health declaration. There's also something called the entry-exit form. The entry-exit form is something where you list, as best as you can, all your trips, hang on, in and out of Israel for at least 7 years. Now, as you're going to see, for people with different, what we call Aliyah statuses, I keep floating that, we're going to get back to it, but some people have to give more, even further back than 7 years, as we're going to see. But the basic, those who have no prior Israeli background, things of that nature, you generally, those who are Olim Chadashim, or as we're going to see, Ezrachim Olim, again, floating terms, but basically the entry-exit form is where you're going to list, as best as you can, your trips in and out of Israel. I know that's challenging because Israel doesn't stamp passports anymore, but you got to do the best you can. If you know that you came for Passover every year, look up in a calendar and figure out when it was, and estimate as best as you can. If it's a little off by a little bit, it's still good. Waiver of confidentiality is something you sign. Very good. And all of these things, like we said, you're going to be uploading to your online portal. What else? There's something called proof of living abroad. Proof of living abroad is something that shows that your main residence has been outside of Israel, again, for at least 7 years. For some people, it'll actually be more. What can you use? Things like passports that date back 7 years. If your current passport doesn't date back 7 years, then if you happen to be among the few that were able to keep the old canceled passports, and you thought you needed it for something and everybody thought you were crazy, well, now you've been vindicated, because it'll help you, because that counts for proof of living abroad. Otherwise, there are lots of other things that can be used: old tax returns, letters from employers, school records, things like that, or letters from schools indicating years that you were there. Also, a criminal background check with an apostille. Criminal background checks are FBI background checks from the US and the RCMP background checks from Canada. And those background checks, though, are required from you for every country that you lived in for a year or more after age 14. That's very important. So if you spent more than a year as an exchange student, let's say in England, yes, you will need to get a background check with an apostille from England as well, and there are ways to do it remotely. Again, your Aliyah advisor will be able to help you with that, but this is important. Now, people say sometimes, especially when it comes to this, people say, you know what, I got a great idea. I'm not going to tell anybody, and then I won't have to get the background check. As with all those kind of things. Here's the challenge that I found with Olim, unfortunately, that I've done that, because sometimes these things will come out. And if they do, it's going to be required. Now, if it's going to be required anyways, it's best to get it now when you still have a whole bunch of months before your Aliyah, rather than to find out about it a month or two before you plan on leaving, and now you have to scramble and get this stuff. Isn't that fair? So ideally, be upfront, please, with your Aliyah advisor. Be as open as you can with regards to this, so that we can be able to advise you as best as possible. And that way we can help you move through this process in time for your projected Aliyah date. There are additional forms and documents depending on different types of situations. And again, those things will appear either in your Aliyah portal. Your Aliyah advisor will be able to advise you on those in those regards. So there are other things that can be. Now, what's an apostille? People say, what's an apostille? Simply put, an apostille is an authentication. It's an extra document that is attached onto the physical document, the birth certificate, the marriage certificate, whatever it might be, that allows the document itself to be recognized in Israel. It's kind of like a notary on steroids. It's a way of authenticating the signature that's on the document, so that in Israel they can look at it and say, okay, we know it's not forged. That's basically what it is. And now, if it was that simple to get, then we'd be all, it'd be wonderful. The challenge that has come up really is mostly due to COVID, because many of the offices in the United States are now understaffed. They are working only partial hours, and therefore it's become much more challenging to be able to get the apostille. Luckily, there are companies that will get the apostilles for you. On the downside, though, they do charge, obviously. And so if you're able to get the apostille directly from the office that issues them, in the United States, it comes from the Secretary of State in the state in which the document originated. In foreign countries, there are offices that issue them. Now, Canada, though, Canada is different. Canada does not work with apostilles. So therefore, in order to authenticate a Canadian document, you need something called an Israeli consular stamp. Again, it's a piece of paper that is attached to form, or it's a document attached to the document itself. The thing is that the Canadian documentation needs generally to be sent first for further authentication before it can be sent to the Israeli consulate. So now when you're wondering, oh my gosh, how do I authenticate my Canadian documents? Luckily, the the Jewish agency representative in Toronto, whose name is Veronica. She's a wonderful, wonderful woman, and she's actually very helpful. Now, also because of COVID, it's very difficult to reach her as well, but she is. You can email her, you can send her a picture at least, and she'll be able to advise you about the process and maybe even be able to assist you to some extent, if that's the case. Let's move on though. These from apostilles and from consular stamps. And the last thing we're going to talk about are these Aliyah statuses that we mentioned. These things, different Aliyah statuses have to do with, from a technical perspective, if a person already has Israeli citizenship, it'll affect the way the person is processed. It'll affect the documentation that the person has to bring, and it may also affect the person's benefits when they arrive in Israel. And that's why it's so important. And again, this is nothing that you yourself will have to do, but you will hear your Aliyah advisor talking about it. You will hear the Jewish agency referring to this. And that's why it's important, so we can get a good handle on your Aliyah status and we can advise you about your documentation. Very quickly, an Oleh Hadash, as we talk about, is somebody who has no prior Israeli background. You've never been a temporary resident in the past. You never made Aliyah in the past. Neither of your parents were Israeli when you were born. And therefore, because of that, you have no prior Israeli background. You're an Oleh Hadash. You have the basics documentation required. When you arrive in Israel, you'll be processed upon arrival. It's an Ezrach Oleh, on the other hand, is someone who is born to Israeli parents outside of Israel. Now, believe it or not, some of you may be sitting there thinking, hey, that's me. Believe it or not, Israeli citizenship passes to first generation. And that means those individuals born outside of Israel to an Israeli parent have Israeli status. You already have it. Now, you may not know it. You're supposed to have an Israeli passport. Don't worry, I'm not telling anybody on you, but you will need to get one before they will give you your Aliyah approval. And that's going to be one of the steps involved with someone who's an Ezrach Oleh. The same thing similarly to a Katin Choser. A Katin Choser is a special status of someone who was born in Israel or made Aliyah with his or her parents at a very young age. So they have Israeli citizenship already, but they left Israel before the age 14 with their parents. And therefore, since they left at such an early age, they are still eligible for Aliyah benefits. The documentation that you're going to have to bring is going to be different. First of all, you will need your Israeli passport, but also here's where you're going to see the amount of entries and exits that you have to log, and the amount of proof of living outside of Israel is going to go all the way back to when you were 14 years old. Now, some of you are sitting here and you may be 17, 18, 19 years old, and it's not such a big deal. I've worked with Olim who are in their 60s, 70s, and 80s. Actually, not 80s, but actually, yeah. And they had to get this. They had to trace back for the past 50 years or whatever it might have been, or 60 years. It's doable. It happens. We'll be able to advise you on that. Temporary residents. We're just going to run through the last ones. Former temporary residents. Anyone who is in Israel in the past as a temporary resident, it's a special visa. We're not talking about being here as a student. We're not talking about being here as a tourist. Temporary residents actually were given Israeli identification numbers. And because of that, it creates a little bit of a difficulty in processing when you arrive. Of course, we've dealt with them, so we'll be able to advise you about what's going to happen. But as you'll see, first of all, there's a wonderful article on our website that describes the entire process and what to expect. I know it's a fantastic article because I'm one of the people that wrote it, and I refer you to that. But you'll also be advised by your Aliyah advisor about any documentation, any benefits that may be affected. Finally, we're going to skip Mishpachat Olim for a second. A Toshav Choser is an Israeli who left Israel after the age of 14, has been outside of Israel a certain amount of time, and is now coming back to Israel. That person technically is not making Aliyah because he or she is already Israeli, but there may be certain benefits available from the state of Israel that they put into place to entice that individual to come back. Now, why is Toshav Choser important? Because, let's go back to Mishpachat Olim. Someone who is Israeli, like we said, a Toshav Choser, now returning to Israel, who is married to an Oleh Hadash, Oleh Hadasha, someone who has Aliyah benefits, and they had children outside of Israel, Ezrachim Olim, okay, or Ezrachim Ktinim as we call them, that individual, now the family is eligible for benefits as an entire family, which means even the Israeli member of the family, the Israeli spouse, will be entitled to things like the free flight to Israel, as well as other benefits. So all of these things, I know we rushed through them really quickly. all of these things are going to come into play because they're going to affect the documentation required, and therefore they're also going to affect the perhaps the benefits, and most importantly, they can affect the timeline of your Aliyah. That's why it's so important that you get started with this process. We'll be able to advise you if there's anything that comes up and if there's any change in the documentation. And I believe that's the last slide that we have on the procedural aspect, if I'm not mistaken. No, a little bit more. I apologize. There's also things could affect the paperwork and therefore could affect the timeline. Special paperwork, if those who were born in the former Soviet Union or in and around the former Soviet bloc, that can affect paperwork significantly and timing significantly. Also, people born in Middle Eastern countries as well, other than Israel. Those who have Israeli status, like we mentioned, from their parents, but are not yet registered with the Israeli consulate, they need to work on that. We already mentioned conversion documents. There are extra conversion documents that are required. Anyone who has any discrepancy in their documentation, if the names do not match on their birth certificate and on their passport, or if they've ever done a name change, all of these things will require extra documentation. Adoptions, previous marriages we mentioned, these all require extra documentation and will add time to the procedure and are important to be addressed as soon as possible. And finally, the Jewish agency often will ask for additional documentation if needed. Also, letters from doctors. If someone is elderly or if there's question about their health status, they may need a letter from a doctor to show that they are fit to fly and that they'll be able to function in Israel on their own as well. Let's see, is that the last slide or did I misjudge? Here we go. Finally, as far as Aliyah benefits, these are your door prizes. We have, I'm just going to run through quickly. You can see them there. The Aliyah benefits that you are eligible for include a free flight, which means you can bring 2 pieces of luggage. You can see the Aliyah flight schedule on our website. You get a free taxi from the airport, courtesy of the Ministry of Absorption. There is basic Israeli healthcare for most individuals, depends on, again, your Aliyah status, but basic Israeli healthcare from when you arrive in Israel, from when your Aliyah is processed after arrival. For different people, your Aliyah processing can happen either in the airport or it'll happen outside. Again, your Aliyah advisor will advise you on that. Ulpan is a 5-month intensive Hebrew learning program that's available from the state of Israel. As long as you started within the first 18 months, Israel will pay for it. There are also private options that may be subsidized, may or may not be subsidized, that are interested, they're worth looking into. There are tax breaks that are available to new Olim. There are customs benefits if you're bringing in personal items, if you're going to be bringing in shipments of items, or if you're going to bring in packages. There are customs benefits available. You're allowed up to 3 shipments of personal items within the first 3 years, and Israel will waive the import taxes. You pay the shipping, but they waive the import taxes on most things. There are benefits on cars. If you purchase or import a car, it's not free, but there's definitely benefits, there's savings, there's lower mortgage rates that are available. There's something called sal klita, which is money that Israel throws at you for the first 6 months or so. Welcome to Israel, cha-ching. It's not enough to live on, but it's a nice chunk of change. And again, we have articles you'll be able to look up to see exactly how much that's going to be to put that into your budget. There is rent subsidy that kicks in around the 8th month after you've completed your Aliyah. And also there are higher education subsidies for a bachelor's or a master's degree. Again, there are age limits in that respect as well, and there may be limitations based on the programs as well. Let's see if we have one more slide, or is it the last one? Last one. This is it. As far as Aliyah, the difference is people say, what's it like making Aliyah during COVID-19? So it's very important to understand the situation is always changing. I always say we can talk about what the situation is right now. Right now, anyone arriving in Israel has to go into quarantine. Now, those who have been vaccinated or those who have recovered from the virus means that that individual has antibodies. Now, I'm not a doctor. This is about the extent of my medical knowledge about this, but that means that can be detected. So a person needs to go into quarantine. If a person has those antibodies, they can get what's called a serological test. They send those results indicating they have antibodies to the Ministry of Health, and they can get a get out of quarantine free card. Not exactly, but that's basically what it is, that they allow the person to go to leave quarantine. And that can happen. It can happen within a day or two, actually, after arrival. But you do still have to have a place to go to from the airport that is considered quarantine. That means it's your own place. It's not a room in somebody else's house. It's your own apartment. It's an own place where you have a kitchen, you have a bathroom, you have a shower, all those kind of things. You also even those who do not have those antibodies are able to get out of quarantine after 10 days with a second negative COVID test that's taken while in quarantine. There's also additional documentation that is required. As you probably have heard, anyone who's flying to Israel needs to get a PCR test, a negative PCR lab test within 72 hours of the flight. There is government documentation that's required to enter Israel. That, luckily, we, Nefesh Benefesh, we get on your behalf once you have your Aliyah approval. But all of this affects the time it takes to book your flight and the lead time that we will need in order to schedule your flight. Lastly, just so you know, you've probably heard about them, but State of Israel is still paying for a COVID hotel. Now, it's not mandatory, thank God, but those who need a place for quarantine are able to opt to go to this quarantine hotel. We, Nefesh Benefesh, must know if you're planning on going there at least 2 weeks prior. Preferably more than that, but once it's less than 2 weeks before your flight, we're not going to be able to reserve a place for you in the hotel. So we must know if that is going to be your plans. Again, discuss it please with your Aliyah advisor, and that person will be able to help you and assist you in that planning. It's been a pleasure on my end to be able to share with you, and I give you over into the able hands of my colleague, Sarah.
Good afternoon again. Thank you, Ari, so much. That was really informative. Great job keeping it to the time. Now I want to use the time remaining to us to talk about the planning aspect. So you've gotten through the paperwork and you understand hopefully a little bit more about what the steps are in the process. And now we're going to talk about the actual planning. Beyond the checklist of the paperwork and collecting your documents and sending them in and having the interview and keeping track of all of that. At the same time, you also need to be spending time focusing on what exactly you're going to do when you get to Israel, especially over the last year with all of the craziness around COVID and how difficult the documents have become. We've seen a lot more people focusing on just getting to Israel. And it's really, really important to us, for your sake, that you continue focusing on the big things like community, where you're going to live. It's important to know where you're going to land and that it's the right place for you and your family. Education, if you have kids in school, making sure that you're getting them into a school system that is appropriate. Healthcare, even if you don't have specific healthcare needs, understanding how the system works and how to take advantage of it, and how to make sure you're set up when you get here is critical. And then finances. At the end of the day, making Aliyah, it's not a program, it's life, and making sure that you are set up and prepared to continue living life, and life costs money, is a big part of your Aliyah planning. Let's zoom into community. I just want to preface and say that we have been doing a whole series of community-specific webinars. They can all be found on our YouTube channel. If you type in Nefesh Benefesh on YouTube, you'll be able to find them, where we are going community by community, and we are interviewing municipal coordinators who work for the city to help Olim, and volunteers within the community and people who live there to help you get a feel for the different communities, especially now that visitors aren't allowed to come to Israel. Pilot trips are impossible, and this is a way for us to virtually give you a glimpse into different communities to help you figure out what is the right community for you. Really important, the main question is to ask, what are you looking for, really? I find it very helpful to sort of come up with a checklist of answer all these questions. What type of city do you want? Do you want a big city? Do you want a small town? Do you want a place where everything is in walking distance, or something is very large? Do you need to be in commuting distance to a certain location, either because your employment or your employment prospects are location specific, or you have a medical condition and the hospital where you're getting your treatment is a certain place and you need to be within a certain distance from there? These are all questions that you need to think about when you think about what kind of community you want. Are you looking for a religious-based community? If you are, what type of religious-based community? Where do you see yourself in North America, and where do you think you could fit in a similar type of community here in Israel? Educational opportunities for your kids. Are there certain things that are important to you and certain communities that have that versus others? Some people want to live next to the beach. Other people want to live in the desert. These are all things that you need to take into account as you are looking into what kind of community would be right for you. Another thing to think about is your support system here in Israel. Short-term versus long-term decisions. Let's say you have a lot of family and friends in one place, and it might not be where you want to live forever, but it's a great idea to come to a place where you have people who can support you and help you get into the community. You might choose to start there and then use your time once you're a little bit more settled to find your forever home in Israel. Discounting having a support system somewhere is not necessarily a good idea. It's a lot of change and a lot of transition when you make Aliyah, and anybody who is here who can support you is definitely a huge help. Community and school contacts. I mentioned already the webinars that we've put together. We also have some groups on Facebook, and we have articles on our website that give contacts of people who live in the communities that you're looking at. The best way to learn about a community is to talk to the people who live there. What is the daily life like? What are the schools like? What is the commute like to main locations for jobs? What is the housing market like? Availability and affordability. You might want to live in a place that seems perfect to you, but there are no rentals. There are only a few houses that go on the market every year, and it's out of your budget. These are all things that you'll need to look into when trying to decide which community. I like to think of it as a puzzle that you sort of have all the different pieces and you try to piece together. You have all the different individual aspects of what you think would make the right community for you. And then using the resources we have available to you, piecing together which towns, which communities here in Israel will fit as much as possible of your puzzle. Those of you who are coming with kids, it's really important to take your kids' integration into mind and into account, especially those of you coming with older children, young teenagers or older teenagers. You are only as happy as your most unhappy child. If your kids don't speak any Hebrew and they're not really on board with your Aliyah plans, but they're begrudgingly coming along, if you want to move them to a community where there are no other English speakers and the school system isn't really set up for helping OLED children, especially from English-speaking countries, it is very likely that it will make the transition for your children more difficult. Another piece to take into consideration when you're trying to decide what community you think is right for you. There are, sort of the highlight communities where most Olim from English-speaking countries end up. Part of that is not because people necessarily want to be in an English-speaking bubble, but they know that they're going to a place where it'll be easier for their family to integrate. This is like Efrat and Modi'in and Yerushalayim and Tel Aviv and Ra'anana. Names you've probably all heard. Not that there aren't lots of other communities that answer the need of Olim, but there is a reason why so many Olim go to a lot of the same communities like Shemesh. And again, we have resources for all of those and others available to you. Moving on a little bit, I'm going to speak about the education system a little bit more. Step number one is understanding the education system. We have put together a few webinars that are also on our YouTube channel with specifics that go really in depth about the school system, but just as an overview, from age 3, basically all public school for children from age 3 and up is covered by the state. Often there are small fees that go to the school or insurance, but it's essentially free. Before age 3, it's any combination of private babysitting or somebody who has a small gun in their home or somebody who has a bigger daycare in a more official facility, but those are all private. There are 2 chains of semi-government daycare centers where they're subsidized by the government based on all kinds of criteria, like your family income and your status as an Oleh, and the hours that each parent works, how many family members there are in the family. So there's all these calculations, and while it's not free, they are subsidized. From age 3 and up, children go into the GAN system. There are 3 years of GAN that are part of the public system. There is what's called Trom Chova for 3-year-olds, Trom Chova for 4-year-olds, and Gan Chova, which is kindergarten for 5-year-olds. And first grade starts at age 6. The school year cutoff in Israel goes by the calendar year that you were born, from January 1st to December 31st. Everybody in that year is one grade, and you move up to a grade based on the year that you're turning the age of that grade. So let's say school starts September 1st, and your child's 6th birthday is October 7th. That child will be starting first grade when they're 5 and almost 6, and they'll have their birthday during turning 6 during first grade. Some elementary schools continue all the way through 8th grade before high school, and others cut off at 6th grade. And there's sort of a middle school for 7th and 8th grades before high school. Different regions have different methods of breaking up elementary and high school. Schools are either public schools, semi-public, or private. Typically, a lot of the private schools are more in the Haredi communities. Public schools are broken up between religious public and non-religious public. It's not like in an American public school where there will be no Jewish education whatsoever in a non-religious public school, but it's definitely not the same atmosphere and rigor of Jewish education as a public religious school. That's what's called the Mamad system, the Mamlechti Dati. Mamlechti is the regular public school. And some of the private schools or semi-private, I don't know if you've heard of some of the democratic schools or Montessori type schools, those tend to have government funding and be semi-private, but also cost more than public school. Once you understand what type of school is right for your child, whether it's a mamlechti or let's say you're Chabad and you want to go to Chabad school, although many of their schools are part of the public system, but it's important to know what kind of school you want for your child. There's also figuring out where those schools are located. Elementary schools are usually zoned based on where you live. There are in some cases regional schools depending on where you live that take from a large area, but if you want a specific school, if you know about it, it's important to understand where they're pulling the kids from to register for that school. Private schools or in semi-private, you often have to apply and get in. Some of them fill up at kindergarten and then the kids move up through the grades, so there isn't necessarily room at every grade level. These are important things to think about when you're trying to figure out what is the best school for your child. If you are planning on sending your kids into one of the public school systems, either the Ganim or the schools, by law, the city or the municipality that's in charge of wherever you're living has to provide your child a space in public school. Either Gan or elementary school or high school, you show up, they can't register you without an ID number for your child, as well as you having a registered address in that municipality. Once you come, you're in touch with the municipal coordinators or the municipality if there is no municipal coordinator, and they by law have to find a place for your child in school. For towns and communities that do have municipal coordinators, the earlier you're in touch with them, the better, so that you can discuss your arrival and the fact that you will have children in certain grades so they can help the school prepare, even if you're not officially registered. School registration in Israel is typically done in January and February. So if you're interested in any sort of private situation, one that they don't legally have to have a spot for you, you would want to be in touch with the school directly by January of the year that you would want your child to be starting school, so that you can try to arrange getting in and registering. It's important to know that OLET children have certain benefits in the school system. These benefits start from first grade and they go all the way through high school. Some of them are dependent on what age the child arrived, but for the first year, children are entitled to help in the school. They're pulled out of their classroom for a certain number of hours a week and given Hebrew lessons, help with their Hebrew, help with their homework, and figuring out how to go to school in Hebrew. Different schools will have different setups for how these hours are given. You might have heard that certain towns have ulpan in the school for the OLED kids. In places that have more OLED children, the school has more resources to provide these types of things for the children. But no matter where you end up, legally they are eligible for help from the school funded by the state. This is something that you need to make sure that your children are getting. It's important to advocate for them, to be in touch with the principal, to be in touch with their teacher, and make sure they're getting what is available to them, because the children are not given Ulpan hours. They don't get what adults get of Hebrew language classes. It's all done through the school system. One of the big challenges is often not knowing what it is that you need, what you need to push for, what you're eligible for, and making sure that your child gets those extra hours is a real biggie. Also know that culturally, not all the teachers and not all the principals understand what it is that you and your child are going through, and you need to put yourself out there and reach out and be in touch and maybe feel like you're nudging and bugging, but to make sure that they understand how your child is doing and that you understand how your child's doing in the classroom, so you can all work together to make sure that everything is going smoothly for integration into school. Healthcare. Everybody, whether you're healthy and young or have healthcare needs, it's important to understand how healthcare works in Israel. By law, every Israeli citizen is entitled to be covered under the Kupat Olim system. Kupat Olim is the healthcare system. There is every 2 years, the government renews the list of everything that's in what's called the health basket. And these are all of the services and medications and tests and everything that's available under the National Healthcare Plan gets updated every 2 years. The healthcare plan is administered by 4 different health funds, the Kupot Cholim. They are Klalit, Maccabi, Meuchedet, and Leumit. Before you make Aliyah, you will need to choose which, it's like an HMO, which Kupat Cholim you're going to be joining. Legally, they all have to provide the same services. Since it's government mandated, the main differences are going to be access to those services. If you live in a small community in a remote part of the country, most likely your only option will be Klalit, because they tend to have smaller clinics spread out all over the country. If you're in a big city, it matters a lot less because they'll all be strongly represented. If you have specific healthcare needs, we recommend researching well in advance to make sure that your medications are available in Israel. If there are specialists and doctors that you need to see, some of them you might, be recommended somebody and find out that they only work with one of the Kupot Cholim, and then you'll decide, okay, I want to be able to see this specialist. I'm going to choose that Kupat Cholim because that is my top priority. Maybe I'll have to travel a little farther for other services, but as long as I can see the specific specialist. Everybody's situation is unique, and so it's really important to make sure that you're taking a good look at what your situation is and making sure that you can answer all of your healthcare needs. All of the health funds, the Kupot Cholim, have semi-private additional levels of insurance that are available for purchase. These provide bigger discounts on prescription medication, more visits that you're allowed with a private specialist for second opinions. If you need special surgeries, being able to go to private hospitals, they provide all kinds of additional services and benefits. If you sign up within 3 months of making Aliyah for any of these additional levels, and they all have multiple levels that you could choose from, all of the waiting periods are waived. If a regular Israeli were to sign up for an additional level out of the blue, they would have to wait, they have to pay in the system and wait a certain number of months before they could access the services. Olim, if they sign up within the first 90 days after Aliyah, can access all healthcare services immediately. Those of you who are coming to Israel as Olim Chadashim, you will leave the airport registered for healthcare. You'll get a receipt as part of your paperwork at the airport that you have been signed up for one of the Kupot Cholim, and within a day or two, you'll show up in the computer system and you will be totally covered. Anybody who has an existing Israeli status of some kind will need to arrange some sort of private healthcare for at least the first few weeks to a month after arrival, because there's more paperwork involved and it's not automatic, and we just want to make sure that you are covered for any scenario should something chas v'shalom come up and you need medical attention before the bureaucracy is taken care of. Finances. Like I mentioned, Aliyah is not a program, it's not a summer camp, it's not a vacation, it's life, and it is important to make sure that you take a good look at your budget and cost of living to make sure that you're prepared for all the financial eventualities when you get to Israel. We have sample budgets on our website, which break down things in a very detailed manner for families of different sizes, to give you an idea of what things may cost in general terms. We also have a whole series of webinars specifically dedicated to financial Aliyah planning. I highly recommend you take a look at them. At the end of the day, your financial viability for Aliyah is your earning potential and your savings minus your projected expenses. And the more detail you have, the better prepared you are, the easier it will be to make sure you're set financially for your Aliyah. Another key thing to research beyond just what are the sample budgets or what are your employment opportunities. Different fields have different salary ranges, different areas of the country have different similar jobs in different areas of the country might earn different salaries, but your cost of living might be different. And these are complicated calculations that are important to do to just get an idea and make sure that you are prepared. Understanding how taxes and your payslip work is an important piece of figuring out your monthly budget here. We have webinars for those as well, but it's important to know that for all of your local, your income, your earned income, if you're working as an employee of a company, taxes are taken at source every month directly from your payslip. One of the Aliyah benefits is that you have a discount on those taxes. Everybody is given income taxes calculated based on a point system, and everybody is given a certain number of points based on their personal status. Olim is for the first 3 years, different number of points. Parents, depending on the ages of your children, give you a certain number of points. Women have a different point structure than men, but it's important to understand how those taxes work. Also, every citizen who's working has Bituach Leumi, which is the National Security Institute. They pay for Kupat Cholim and maternity leave and disability insurance and your estate pension. That is also deducted at source from your paycheck. One of the things to keep in mind are also lifestyle changes that might affect your budget. If you're sending your children to private school in North America, your education costs will be drastically different when you get to Israel. Maybe you will suddenly find that you're shopping in the shuk more often and your grocery bill changes drastically from what it was, from what you were used to. Typically, depending on where you live, you might or might not have 2 cars, or maybe you had 3 or 4 cars and you'll only have 1 or 2. All sizes of apartments are different. Potentially your utilities will be different than what you're used to. And these are all things that we have resources to help you sort of figure out and calculate. There's a wonderful Facebook group called Living Financially Smarter in Israel that has great resources and discussions to help you wrap your head around your financial planning. And also keep in mind your Aliyah benefits. Sal Klita for the first 6 months, families are given an amount based on the number of people who make Aliyah as part of the family. The tax breaks, all of those things add up and they will definitely contribute to your financial picture. I hope that I know we breezed through a whole lot of information, but I hope that this was a good session to sort of wrap your head around where to start, what to make sure you're looking at, what to make sure you're taking care of, so that the rest of your Aliyah process will be as smooth as possible. Like we said, if you have an Aliyah advisor and you have specific questions, please reach out to your advisor. If you don't know who your advisor is or you're not sure, you can either reach aliyah@nbn.org.il or email Ari or I directly. Our email addresses are up on the screen right now. And I hope you all have a wonderful week. B'hatzlacha rabah in the rest of your Aliyah plans, and we really, really look forward to welcoming you home. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, and we are here for anything you need. Take care.